Let me know when that started and we can banter.
Yeah, the stream just started, and yeah, we'll be waiting some minutes. Yeah, like in university, I did a lot of competitive programming, and C++ is the most popular language because of the performance. Yeah, yeah, the subset of C++ that competitive programmers use is, well, is not all of C++. So you only write code in one file, and just, yeah. So that you expect only, you don't write many classes, you don't write many templates, if you don't want to get fancy, and yeah, a lot of, you only use like some subset of C++. Yeah, I did the same. Yeah. And in the US, there are several ranges, right? So yeah, in Mexico, there's only one. So yeah. Oh, yeah. It's, yeah. Well, I tried to study programming when I was like in high school, and there were a lot of resources for university students at the time, and at the time people used Perl, they used C, and I tried and failed with a lot of them, and I don't really remember which one clicked for me, but some, well, yeah, one of them clicked, and then I kind of learned C and used that until people at university convinced me to use C++ because they showed me like vector, and oh yeah, you can have like a container of everything, and I told them, no, oh really, everything? And they told me, yeah, really? Yeah, everything. And yeah, I started using C++ because of vectors, and that can have like, yeah, because in C I used to code like, yeah, it was, yeah, yeah, that kind of thing with, yeah. Yeah. So, mm, yeah. Yeah, for me, it was really hard for me because, yeah, in these tutorials for university students, they use language like real number, and yeah, when you're like in junior high school, like 12 or 13 years, you don't know what a real number is, and it's really, it was, that was the hard part for me, like a lot of words I didn't know, and yeah, and my English was not so good at the time, so yeah.
And so I'd like read about stuff like, "Hey, this is what a function is." And I'd be like, "I have no idea why this matters. This is like, why would you ever do that? This is so weird." And would just have to like sit and think on it for days, weeks, and eventually be like, "Oh, now I get it. This is how you use that." It was, yeah.
So I think we can start. We have like 40 people on Twitch and some people also in YouTube.
Okay.
So I'm gonna be starting, and yeah, so I'm gonna be speaking Spanish. When you start your presentation, you can do it in English. And
All right.
actually, the chat on Twitch is speaking English, so I think that's a good sign.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Then I won't be too embarrassed.
yeah. Don't worry. I made a poll, and most people say they will be fine with
Okay.
an English presentation.
Well, I thank you. I appreciate
Yeah,
not having to use my terrible, bad, not even remotely sufficient Spanish. So
yeah. So and in the Q&A session, yeah, I think there's gonna be time to translate every question and every answer without
okay,
interrupting you. So yeah,
okay. I will try to keep my answers brief.
okay. Bueno, pues ya vamos a empezar con el primer meetup de C++ México. Saludos al chat de Twitch y saludos al chat de YouTube. Ahorita estamos por esas dos redes sociales y si pueden compartir el stream con todos sus amigos para que eh, puedan aprovechar esta gran oportunidad del invitado que tenemos. Sería muy bien, sería muy bueno. Saludos sonideros, exactamente. Bien, vamos a empezar un poco hablando de C++ México. Este es nuestro logo, del cual estamos muy orgullosos gracias a la diseñadora que lo hizo para la comunidad. Es un Quetzalcóatl y referencia a una parte de la cultura muy mexicana, ¿no? Incluso antes de la llegada de los españoles a México, era parte de nuestra cultura y yo creo que por eso le gustó mucho a la comunidad. Bien, la agenda. Hoy vamos a tener, es el primer meetup, entonces les voy a presentar a la comunidad. Ya tenemos una comunidad, no estamos empezando desde cero. Eh, Gracias al logo conseguimos muchos seguidores y la comunidad creció bastante rápido, bastante más de lo que esperaba. Y después de presentar la comunidad y los objetivos de por qué iniciamos una nueva comunidad, vamos a empezar con la plática de Titus Winters, nuestro invitado especial. Y esta plática va a ser en inglés, va a ser un poco corta. Y después vamos a pasar a la parte principal, que es la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Esta parte pueden hacer sus preguntas en español y las vamos a traducir en inglés y así, o las pueden hacer en inglés y todas las preguntas y las respuestas las vamos a decir en español y en inglés para que no haya ningún problema. La plática, aunque va a ser hablada en inglés, la voy a subtitular y va a quedar grabada. Entonces, no se preocupen si su inglés no es muy bien, ¿no? De cualquier manera van a poder aprovechar el contenido. Sí. Eh, Presentación. Eh, yo soy Big Fred, me encuentro como Big Fred en Twitter y tenemos de invitado especial a Titus Winters. Eh, Titus Winters, software, ingeniero de software en Google, es Senior Staff Software Engineer en Google, tiene un puesto bastante rimbombante. Eh, y es C++ Library Lead, esto tiene que ver con el comité de C++. Autor del libro Software Engineering Book, del cual, por cierto, tenemos una sorpresa sobre este libro, entonces quédense porque les conviene. Este es el libro del cual es el autor principal, nuestro invitado, y está muy bien. Está muy bien. Si quieren, si están aquí solo, si no saben C++ y solamente están aquí por el invitado porque es de Google y así, y les conviene quedarse, porque al final este libro tiene mucho que ver. Es fundador de Upsale. Y yo, su anfitrión, Big Fred, recientemente también inicié en Google como software engineer, soy matemático y como no tengo tantos logros como nuestro invitado, les pongo que me gusta aprender idiomas, los gatos, y que tengo un stream en Twitch sobre algoritmos en el cual resuelvo problemas todos los domingos. Ok, bien. En contacto, ¿dónde nos pueden encontrar? Tenemos una página web donde básicamente solamente ahorita tenemos esta misma información que están viendo en el slide. Tenemos Twitter, eh, donde ponemos los anuncios de todos los eventos que vamos a hacer y de los recursos que creamos. Si nos pueden seguir, genial. Este Twitch, que seguro la mayoría nos está viendo por Twitch. Tenemos un grupo de Telegram donde platicamos casualmente tanto de C++ como de otros lenguajes y de programación en general. Somos 350 y hay programadores muy buenos, entonces si se pueden unir estaría perfecto. Generalmente hablamos temas relacionados, no, o sea, no nos restringimos solamente a que si no hablan de C++ los baneamos, ¿no? No. Hay programadores muy buenos y pueden tener pláticas amenas que estén relacionadas a la programación. Estamos por YouTube, como CPP México, un canal de Discord, un servidor de Discord y estamos en GitHub, por si quieren tener el logo en su perfil. Ok, ¿cómo empezó todo? Todo esto empezó porque pues, yo como programador de C++ me la pasaba como hablando siempre de C++, aunque en el trabajo no usara C++. Y entonces varias veces me sugirieron iniciar un grupo de C++ en varios trabajos y al final me animé, ¿no? Y yo creo que empezamos un poco lento, pero con el logo que le gustó a tanta gente, crecimos muy rápido. Entonces, como que todo esto se puso muy serio gracias al logo. El cual, por cierto, también tenemos una sorpresa si quieren usarlo en Twitch. Lo pueden usar como emoticon. Eso ahorita les cuento. O al final. Entonces tenemos como les digo, estamos en Twitter. Ya crecimos bastante rápido. Esto comparado con otras comunidades, ya somos, apenas empezamos el mes pasado y ya somos unas de las, al menos con más seguidores, ¿no? En Twitter. Tenemos un canal de Telegram, como les digo, donde platicamos, eh, plática relacionada a programación y a cosas de C++ y de otros lenguajes que están relacionados a C++. Servidor de Discord también, por si son más chavos, como que a los chavos más chavos les gusta usar Discord. Estamos en Discord. Esta es la página web, como ven es muy simple, solamente tiene los enlaces a nuestras comunidades. Esperamos crecerla, pero por ahorita solo tiene eso. Y como uno de nuestros primeros logros, tenemos que aparecimos en la página oficial del comité de C++. ¿No? Aquí estamos y pues, me parece muy bien para una comunidad que acaba de nacer, ¿no? Que ya estamos teniendo reconocimiento. Y estamos en GitHub, ¿no? Sí. Y por cierto, si quieren tener el icono de C++ México en su perfil, pueden unirse a esta, por el canal de Telegram, pueden pasarme su nick y pueden tener la, la estampita de C++ México en su perfil de GitHub. Ok, ¿por qué una comunidad de C++? Bien, en especial de C++ México. Eh, Voy a platicar un poco de qué nos motivó a hacer esta comunidad, en particular en México. Por lo que yo he visto y en mi experiencia, ¿no? No digo que esto sea la verdad absoluta, pero lo que yo he visto en mi vida de programador en la Ciudad de México y también conozco un poco a la comunidad de Guadalajara y de Monterrey. Entonces, basado en mi experiencia, ¿por qué iniciar una comunidad de C++ México? Ok. En México lo que he visto, al menos, esto ya está cambiando poco a poco, lo cual me gusta, pero eh, al menos por un tiempo, mi percepción era de que todas las comunidades en México se basaban en web, ¿no? Habría ese, más o menos, aunque ellos se quieren diferenciar entre hacer backend o frontend, pero al final están haciendo trabajo para una página web, el cual no está mal, está muy bien, pero está muy centrado en un nicho, ¿no? Y eh, como que otro tipo de programación, como el tipo de programación que hacemos en C++, no se atendía en estas comunidades, ¿no? Ahorita, recientemente, con lo de Machine Learning y inteligencia artificial y todo esto, empieza un poco a haber más comunidades un poco más variadas en México, data science y todo eso. Pero aún así, la comunidad del tipo de personas que programan C++, siento que todavía no está atendida. Entonces es por eso que decidimos iniciar una comunidad de C++. ¿Y cuáles son los casos de uso de C++? Aquí pongo algunos que son los que yo estoy más familiarizado y me parece que son los más representativos de C++. Alto rendimiento, optimización, desarrollo de videojuegos grandes, videojuegos AAA, los de consola, o generalmente los juegos los más grandes que salen, que se les llama AAA, están hechos en C++. Los juegos indie, un poco menos, se usa C++ un poco menos, pero también se sigue usando. Pero en los juegos grandes, todos están hechos en C++, todos, todos. Sistemas embebidos, ahí no diría que es el dominante, pero tiene una buena parte del mercado. Aquí el dominante sería C++, ¿no? Digo C sin más. Eh, en sistemas de latencia baja, por ejemplo, haciendo trading electrónico, las em, es C++, yo creo que es el más dominante. Eh, Inteligencia artificial, TensorFlow, usa C++ y también cuando quieres procesar cantidades grandes de datos, no te queda de otra. O sí te queda, pero pierdes mucho al no usar C++. Y otros casos, ¿no? Estos son los que yo estoy más familiarizado, pero hay más casos de uso. Y bien, como les digo, en esta comunidad no solamente nos dedicamos a C++, sino, o sea, no nos cerramos, no somos ningunos autómatas que solo siguen C++ y como la única religión, sino que estamos abiertos a otras alternativas. En particular, estos lenguajes, lenguaje D, Rust, NIM y SIG, todos estos yo diría que nacieron para intentar reemplazar a C++. Esto ya tiene muchos años, tiene 20 años que quieren reemplazar a C++. Ha habido lenguajes, por ejemplo Java, así muchos saben que Java así nació y nació intentando reemplazar a C++. Después ya tomó otros caminos, pero así nació, ¿no? Y ahorita hay otros lenguajes más nuevos, digamos, como Rust, NIM, SIG y D, que tienen el mismo objetivo, tienen el mismo objetivo de alto rendimiento y demás, pero empezando desde cero, ¿no? Porque eh, lenguajes ya de tanta edad como C++, ya no les puedes cambiar cosas tan fácil, ¿no? Muchas veces es mejor empezar desde cero. Entonces, en esta comunidad también estamos abiertos a hablar de sus lenguajes. Y estos, por cierto, son los stickers que pueden usar si se unen al grupo de Telegram. Ya, objetivos y actividades. El objetivo principal es formar una comunidad. Una comunidad es un grupo de personas donde todos se pueden ayudar y se benefician al mismo tiempo, ¿no? A lo mejor algunos pueden ayudar en otras cosas, o algunos en otras, y pues todos nos beneficiamos de nuestro trabajo. Es el objetivo principal. Ahora, vamos a crear contenido en español. eh, es otra de los objetivos y pues una vez al mes hacer un meetup para hacer un poco de networking con otros programadores que tienen intereses similares. ¿Ok? Mm, Bien. Y ahora vamos a empezar con nuestro invitado principal. Él nos va a dar una plática primero y después vamos a empezar con la sesión de preguntas. Okay, Titus, I think you can. Hi, I think this is the first
Hi.
time we're on the screen. So, hi. And
Hi.
uh, I think you can start with your presentation and then we can go to the Q&A session.
All right.
Yeah,
Sounds
I
good.
think, yeah, maybe I can turn off the caption so it will like put in text like everything you said and I tested it before and it works really, really well.
Okay.
So
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. The inaugural meeting for C++ Mexico. I'm Titus Winters. I'll talk very briefly about the state of C++ in this year 2021. And this will be pretty quick. A little bit about me, a little bit about what I do at Google, a little bit about C++. Mostly just enough so that there's some background for you all to ask questions, and then we can spend the rest of the time with Q&A. So me, I did most of my studies in Southern California. I've been at Google since 2010. Like you said, I'm the lead for C++ libraries here at Google. Underneath me, there's about 3 or 4 teams with about 35 engineers. One of my big major projects a few years ago was launching Absale, which is at absale.io. This is sort of Google's, I won't say standard library because it doesn't cover everything, but it's Google's versions of things that we like better or that the standard library doesn't cover.
we use it a lot, by the way, in Google. Yeah,
Yep,
we use it a
exactly.
lot.
Yeah. I just got done with, about a year ago, we published a book called Software Engineering at Google. Up until actually about a year ago, I was the chair of the standards committee, the subcommittee for the design of the C++ standard library. So more or less, most of the things in the standard library for C++ 20 went through the room that I was chairing. I also, a lot of people seem to use the Google C++ style guide. I'm one of the 4 people that maintains and approves changes to that style guide. So if you have annoyances and concerns and complaints about the style guide, you can bring those to me. So, about C++. C++ has been one of the top 5 programming languages for the last 20 years running. It was originally invented in the mid-'80s, and it has been an international standard for more than 20 years now. Roughly 85% of developers that use C++ are working on C++ 11 or something newer. These are basically what we consider modern version, well, relatively modern versions of C++. And we believe that there's probably at least 5 million C++ programmers in the world working on maybe 50 billion lines of code. So it is a very big, very important sort of language. It currently has new standards every 3 years, starting in 2011, and going through the most recent on-time delivery in 2020. It's all governed by ISO, the International Standards Organization, which makes some of how C++ works a little weird. The committee occasionally talks about questions of could we ship, standards more regularly? Can we make committee meetings more available? Like, what sorts of things can we do? And some of that we can change, but a lot of it we can't, and it's because ISO is actually an international body that is governed by international treaty, and it goes like all the way back to the League of Nations, like before the United Nations. And so there's whole like diplomats and things that work out the rules under which ISO operates, and then we operate under ISO. When we're not in the midst of a pandemic, somewhere around 100 or 150 experts will fly from all over the world about 3 times a year for 5 or 6 days running to discuss proposals and modifications to the standard. This is sort of like attending a conference with 5 or 6 or 8 parallel tracks going at any given time. And so during my chair as my tenure as the chair for the Library Evolution Working Group, one of those tracks would be Library Evolution, where we talked about the design of the standard library. We've gotten a lot better in the last few years about having more of the material public online. So there are some links here. You can actually view like the process of proposals moving like through the pipeline. So if there's particular things that you're interested in, be those, I don't know, changes to const expert or graphics or networking or contracts or any sorts of things that you might have heard about, like you can sort of track how those things are moving. C++20 was the most recent big release, and some features that you might want to talk about or learn about, discuss. We have the new ranges library. Ranges is the largest change to the standard library since probably forever, in all honesty. Most of the standard library, especially the algorithms parts of the standard library, have traditionally been defined in terms of pairs of iterators, right? You define a begin and an end iterator pair, you pass that into something like sort, and it takes that as the range that it's going to sort. And it's hard to even describe what sort is doing without saying the word range. And ranges sort of codifies that so that those iterator pairs or some other forms as well can be operated on as more first-class objects without having to resort to begin and end quite as aggressively. We also added concepts. It's not the original formulation of concepts. Concepts has been discussed in C++, probably going back to, I think it was maybe 2010, certainly the early 2010s. Concepts is very useful if you're a very deep C++ programmer, to replace some of the sort of like sphenai and constraint sorts of things. If you're working in generics and you want to constrain what sorts of types can be fed through a particular template, concepts is a very useful thing, partly because it gives you a better syntax for all of that, and partly because it allegedly allows us to define both semantic as well as syntactic requirements on the types that we're working with in template contexts. We added coroutines. This is a very complicated feature that sort of changes. Instead of functions only have, I call the function and then it returns, under a coroutines model, you can have, you call it and it yields, but it still exists and you can bounce back into it and out of it. And by doing so, this sort of allows us to have more flexibility in control flow. You can build things like generators out of it. You can build all sorts of things. It's very powerful, but it's also very complicated. We added the spaceship operator. This gives us sort of a way to synthesize comparison operations out of a smaller set, so it's a little easier to define value types. And we added C++ modules. This is an attempt to move C++ out of the sort of 1970s era of preprocessor pound includes and try to push it towards something a little bit more modern. At Google, where I spend most of my focus these days, C++ has roughly 12,000 developers that will modify our C++ code in any given month. We have more than 250 million lines of C++ code written by Googlers. And it is the most computationally intensive language at Google. So a significant amount of the computational resources of all of Google's data centers all over the world are spent in C++. I think we're, in terms of lines of code and number of developers, roughly tied for the most used language at Google alongside Java. My teams internally, we focus on education, classes, documentation, guidance, doing things like publishing the Tip of the Week series. Some of those are externally available on abseil.io. We look at portability. How do you share C++ libraries on more platforms? As Google expands from being just a sort of server and web services platform into mobile and all sorts of other things, cloud, it means that there's more platforms that we need to support. And so we have a broader set of problems. I also have teams that run our C++ cloud client libraries. This gives us access to Google Cloud services. It's pretty good. And we also build all of the internal C++ core libraries. So refactoring and research on how to do refactoring at scale, a lot of cleanup and design and maintenance of the code base as a whole. And that's hopefully enough to pique your interest, give you some ideas of what to ask questions about, and we'll cut it there and switch back to Q&A.
Yeah, I think we got some questions. So, what are your favorite C++ 20 and C++ maybe 23 features? Yeah.
So in the end, I'm actually very excited by, and it seems minor, but I don't think it is. I'm very excited by the spaceship operator. It is not as deep.
Yeah, I think people really got excited about it because of the shape. Yeah, like it really looks like a space.
It really looks like a TIE fighter.
Yeah.
So originally we thought that like spaceship could be used to do less than, equals, not equals, greater than, all of the, everything in between there. We eventually actually realized that from a design perspective, it's mostly you can't really do all of those things at once without having a performance penalty. So there were sort of a lot of discussions and a lot of design that went into that. It is a surprisingly subtle sort of space. No pun intended. And but I think in the end, it's a design that I'm really happy with. I'm modestly excited about concepts. I think that will make, especially the sorts of people that are writing like library infrastructure, it will make their lives much, much easier. I think teaching concepts and teaching people how to think in that fashion in terms of design will also be very useful, although I'm not entirely sure whether or not we will wind up in a world where people, like everyday programmers, wind up writing things in concepts particularly often. But I think in terms of enriching the vocabulary and how we approach design, I think there's a lot to be said for it. Conceptually, I'm mostly excited by ranges, but I'm a little worried about some of the things in there. And coroutines, it's kind of, I'm not sure. I think it might be too complicated. Modules helps a lot with some build problems, but it is also extraordinarily hard to move any old existing code from pre-modules to modules. Yeah, and so it's all complicated. Like, and this is kind of how it is in C++. Like we have, like I said, billions of lines of legacy code, and C++ tries really, really hard to not break, existing code. And as a result, that constrains us a lot, and it is very challenging. So it's a very hard problem to evolve a language this old and this big.
Okay, so I'm just gonna summary this question in Spanish.
Sure.
La pregunta fue cuáles eran sus características favoritas de C++ 20 y 23. Y básicamente dice que el Spaceship Operator y los rangos y los módulos, aunque para los módulos es algo difícil cambiar código viejo a código nuevo, código que no usa módulos a código que usa módulos. Y es el resumen, y la traducción completa la pondré cuando quede grabado el video. So next one. Next one is actually from a friend who also works at Google. So what are the most important communities of C++ around the globe, and how can we collaborate?
Most important communities.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that.
It's a hard one. I will not know how to answer that either. But yeah, maybe in like obviously the comedy is it could be counted as a community.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's definitely a very important one.
it is.
Yeah,
It
yeah, yeah.
is. So the ones that I'm most familiar with are certainly the committee, which is a big deal. Um, and I would encourage people, uh, if you have the opportunity, like try to go, uh, participate or witness the committee process at least once if you can. The committee tries to be relatively open. You can't just keep going, but if you show up once, that'll be fine. And you can sort of see what the process is like, and that's kind of important. Um, and you get to meet all those people and put a face to those names and see that they're just people like everyone else.
Okay, so let me ask
Uh,
this question so just to everyone so everyone knows. Like, can anybody just show up at the committee
yeah,
and yeah, okay, that's good.
yeah.
So
Um, Probably only for like one or two meetings before people start like asking you to pay dues and things. But yeah, generally, like we want input from the community as a large. So yeah,
uh,
um,
yeah, I'm just gonna
yeah,
translate the
yeah,
question
makes sense.
in Spanish. So, la pregunta fue cuáles eran las comunidades más importantes de C++ en el mundo y cómo podemos colaborar. Y es una pregunta difícil, pero pues una respuesta obvia sería el comité de C++ y nos platica Titus que de hecho pueden llegar y solamente llegar, no necesitan como invitación, está abierto para todos y obviamente a lo mejor puede como que llegar y intentar participar y están abiertos a colaboración. Yeah, that was it.
Yep. I think the online, like the Twitter community for C++ is very active and very welcoming. I think that's pretty good. Uh, the biggest conferences tend to be uh, CPPCon, maybe C++ Now, but we're seeing a lot of new, like smaller conferences, especially regional ones, and I really want to encourage that.
Yeah,
There's a
and I
lot.
think these past years, like conference have been recording more and more of their talks. Like in the C++
Yep.
Reddit, they are always posting like
Yeah.
talks from their local meetups.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah.
Nos dice Titus que también las comunidades en línea de C++ son bastante buenas, como en Twitter, la comunidad de C++ es bastante buena y también nos habla de que las pláticas, bueno, las conferencias grandes como C++, CPPCon and C++ Now, estas suelen subir sus pláticas en YouTube en línea, entonces las pueden consultar y son muy buenas. Hay algunas de Titus que están. Your talks are there, right? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Quite a few.
Okay, uh, we we're actually getting a lot of questions right now. Like it started slow, but now we're getting a lot.
Yeah.
But I think some of those are really easy to answer. Like, what's your favorite IDE? Like the
What's my favorite? What?
IDE, like environment, programming environment.
Oh, IDE.
Yeah, IDE.
Uh, Externally, I still use Emacs. Internally, we have our own special
Yeah,
stuff.
this is gonna start a word. So
Yeah.
let's go deep into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what recommendations uh, would you give to someone who wants to start in C++ world? Yeah, that's a
Uh,
very big one. But yeah,
it is. I would say more than anything else, practice. Um, and that's not entirely satisfying, but
yeah,
practice, practice,
yeah.
practice.
There's no shortcut. Like,
There's no shortcut.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the same. I think the same.
Yeah. I started learning C++ when I was, I don't know, 14, and just wrote code and kept writing code and wrote more code. And
So
yeah.
I got this. I got this one from, yeah. In the community, we have a lot of people who are not actually C++ programmers, but are kind of curious about it, and maybe they want to start programming. And in particular, we have a lot of people from language similar to C++, like recently Rust and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So, what do you think about these alternatives to C++? Like,
I think
yeah, there's
yeah, I
Rust
think
and
Rust
there's
is a
D.
great language. Uh, I think Rust has a lot going for it. Um, Largely, the reason that I don't think Rust is going to win is because we already have 5 billion lines of very important code.
Yeah,
And like the era of languages becoming dominant without providing a path for legacy is kind of over. So, like maybe Rust will pull it off. I don't know, but like languages like Kotlin and TypeScript and things like that, where we've designed into the language how you replace the old language, like
yeah. And
that's really.
a related question we have is, what do you think about combining Rust and C++? Do you think they can work well together?
I don't. Uh, like most of my teams focus a lot, and like all of our research focuses on how do you refactor things and the things that you can change, like between languages or between APIs, between interfaces. The things that you can change are the places where it's mostly syntactic, but you can do local reasoning to prove that some small change is correct. And what you can't do is make big changes where there's a behavioral difference or a meaning difference, a semantic difference. And Rust has a bunch of different semantics than C++ does. And those are probably better semantics, don't get me wrong. It is cleaner and more modern and a lot easier in a lot of respects. But I don't see how you get rid of 5 billion lines of legacy uh, without like bridging that gap. And there's no way to bridge that gap. So,
I'm just going to
not
summarize
efficient.
those two questions in my translation. So, yeah.
Okay.
Esta pregunta fue sobre qué opina de los lenguajes alternativos a C++. Sabemos que hay varios que tienen como el mismo objetivo de C++, uno de ellos es Rust. La pregunta era si creía que podría reemplazar a C++, y su opinión es que no, porque es muy difícil reemplazar el código, el legacy code que ya existe. Y una pregunta relacionada que hicieron fue que cuál era su opinión de cómo se llevan Rust y C++. Y también su opinión no es muy positiva de que se lleven muy bien, más que nada eh, más allá de cuestiones de sintaxis, también cuestiones de cómo funcionan los lenguajes. Ok, uh, we have another question, another related question. Is there any plan to bring some of the Rust features to C++? And I think, yeah, what do you think about it?
I mean, people
For
try to
example,
bring.
with concepts, I think concepts is similar to Rust traits, but they're both similar
Okay.
to Haskell, Haskell
Yeah.
type classes or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. I think uh, a lot of the good ideas from most languages eventually find
yeah.
their way into other languages. Yeah, so almost certainly. Uh, I can't imagine that we're going to add a borrow checker, but that's not a C++ behavior. But a lot of things, yeah.
Uh, do you like LLVM?
Yeah, we rely on this very heavily.
That was a quick
Yeah,
one. That's why I
yeah.
just wanted to get off the way. And this one, how do you treat with testing? Do you use a unit approach or it became completely automated?
We rely on unit tests and continuous integration extensively. We also have a lot of larger, sort of more expensive system level tests, integration tests, and things like that. It, it has been sort of a rule at Google for probably 15 years now that if you're making any real change to the software, that it has to be accompanied with a test. There was a crisis a long time ago that was making it very slow for Google to, be able to update search. And testing was the answer. Like, testing is how we have reliability and sustainability. And it really has to be automated tests. You can't afford to have this be a manual sort of thing.
We have, let me pick one. How much of Google internal STL goes into the standard C++?
Um,
Like, like,
some, but not a lot. The vast majority of it winds up in Abseil. We don't have a lot of impetus to push things further, like towards the standard. We're kind of okay with it if people propose that, but yeah, we don't push it too
and I
far.
think Boost library is a good place to find this kind of thing, like, right? Like, people test a lot of things in the Boost library, and some of it goes into the standard.
Yep. I think that the standard and boost and abseil all have very distinct and very important roles to play. Boost does not promise stability. Like, boost will change from version to version. Boost is a really, really good proving ground and science experiment. And that's extremely useful if you're writing software that doesn't need to necessarily like change versions or last for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Boost is great. Boost is perfect. The standard promises nothing's ever going to change, which is also really useful in some contexts. Abseil tries to be sort of halfway between those things. Like, we won't promise that you can build and link against older binaries, but we aren't going to break your build. And if we do, we will promise to ship a tool to make that an easy thing for you to adopt. And that's sort of the best we can do. But yeah, there's room for all three of these things. They're all very good and very useful. And I have a lot of respect for all of the people that are working on these.
So I got another question, like it's kind of a social one. Like, in these days, like, people, there's a decreasing number of young people trying to learn C++.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think are the consequences for this? Because I think I saw an article made by Electronic Arts in which they talk about it. Like, uh, C++ is really hard, and if young people don't learn it, it will have some consequences in the future. Like, yeah, what is your view on this regard?
I don't know. Like, um, I don't think it's important for this to be your first language. Like, I think there's lots of languages that are better to learn first.
Yeah,
I think for the time being, C++ is really important if you need the absolute most performance. But you have to also know that you're giving up every bit of safety and like design sensibility. Like, it's going to be a little confusing compared to any language that you might learn that's more modern. On the other hand, it's faster. So at big companies, especially like Google, where there's millions of dollars at stake to make sure that things are as efficient as possible. There's always going to be a need for languages like C++. And so it sort of depends on what what industry you're in. Like if you're in something that's not really computationally intensive, yeah, find something easier for sure.
So this another question. These days, which C++ standard would you recommend for a beginner? Because for example, a lot of people learn C++ at the university and they teach them like really old
No.
stuff, or they just want they already know C and they want to use it C++ just exactly the same as
It's not.
So what's your view on that? Is it
um I think I would probably go with 17. And specifically, I would go with 17 because of optional and variant. And because those are really very useful semantically as vocabulary types. Like those are sort of classic like ideas in type design, and it's a really important thing to work on. 17 also gives you string view, which is not life altering or world shattering. It's not like, oh, this is amazing, but it is surprisingly useful, but also surprisingly dangerous, which is kind of exactly what C++ is. Like surprisingly useful and surprisingly dangerous.
yeah,
And if you can learn to use string view responsibly, then you understand C++, and that's kind of important.
kind of a related question? What do you think is the biggest leap in terms of versions? Like uh, definitely C++ 11 I think was like the
Yeah.
biggest one, but besides that, which one?
I think 11 was definitely the biggest one. Beside that, it's probably 20, but we're still sort of waiting to see how well that works. It'll be a little easier to say that in a couple of years. I think 17 was actually bigger than a lot of people realize, especially for library facilities. 17 changed a lot of the vocabulary, I think, in really important ways. So I would 17 or 20.
And a lot of the questions are asking about recommendations on how to speed up C++ training, and if you can elaborate on education and training endeavors. I think you can. Yeah, I think you have a lot to say about that because I've seen you do a lot of that in Google.
Yeah. Um, Externally, it's harder because it sort of depends on. It depends a lot on if it's the question of I already know C++, I need to refine it. I already know C++, I need to upgrade it to the current version, or I'm trying to learn C++ from scratch. I don't really have an answer for the previous one or for the learning from scratch. Partly, it's just not what Google. It's not the Google problem, For the other bits, C++ core guidelines, abseil tips, watching a lot of the videos that have been posted online.
I think a lot of the CPPCon and C++
Yeah,
now are exactly
yeah,
made for that.
exactly. Like most of it is really pretty high quality. And one of the things that's really important in C++ or in understanding C++ is that there are very few topics that are totally easy and straightforward, right? Like it's a language that's going to make you think about why am I doing it the way that I'm doing it, which is not easy and is a little slower. But if you really understand all of the nuances and the trade-offs in there, then you'll be very powerful. So yeah, I would start with those things. Also, Nico Jasudis has been publishing pretty good books on, modern C++. So I think his C++17 book is pretty good.
So we got a lot of questions kind of related, so I'm just gonna summarize them in
Okay.
one question, like what is the what do you think about the future of C++? Why will someone learn C++ in 2021 instead of, for example, Swift or Rust or any other language? Yeah, like people is looking for motivation to pick C++ above the others.
Uh, I think it's a matter of the exist. Like you got to meet the tech where it is, and like Google has 250 million lines of code here. Facebook has a ton of C++ code. I'm actually a little less sure about Amazon. Apple has a big community there. Like there are other systems languages for sure, but in the end, when you get to a place where the amount that we're spending on compute resources is large, um, it almost always comes back to C++. High performance computing areas, embedded systems areas, autonomous driving, like a lot of these things wind up not being willing to spend the compute overhead to work in a easier language. And Moore's law is slowing down. Like, so I don't see that becoming less of an issue,
I think it slowed down like 10 years ago. Like,
right?
yeah,
So, like, uh, and that's not to say that other domains aren't just as important. It's really a question of like, what's most interesting to you, right? If you're in finance or AI or graphics or things like that, like there are places where the every cycle starts to count.
yeah. I think there are certain areas where C++ is really dominant, and yeah, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
like finance, like high frequency trading, uh, and those kind of.
yeah, yeah. And you can do a decent job in those things with Rust or Swift or C Sharp. Like I've seen success in all of those things, but I think it's more common to see it in C++.
So we got a couple related to the standard library. The first one is it's fast. Do you like the standard library? I
Sort
think
of.
people kind of avoided using the standard library like 20 or something like that years ago because it had yeah, especially in video games I've seen people
Yeah.
recommend to not use it, but it was like some really old like
I yeah. So I have mixed feelings. Like I think there's a lot of very good ideas and good design that goes in there. But at the same time, the two things that C++ cares about most are performance, which is good, and backwards compatibility, which is sometimes not. Like it's very convenient for everything to be backwards compatible, but it does mean that we can't fix things if we ever make mistakes, and everyone makes mistakes.
and
And so, for instance, like I would never in professional code use the hash tables out of the standard library. Like they're vastly too slow, which is exactly what you don't want from a hash table. So it's a little mixed. It's part of why Google invests in things like AppSale.
yeah. And the second one says, thank you, Titus, for the talk. What resources do you recommend to learn about the STD library? By the way, all the questions are in English, so I think our public is really comfortable, and they're speaking English, so I think they're really comfortable speaking English. Yeah.
That is very reassuring.
Yeah.
I apologize for jumping in and not being able to speak Spanish.
Yeah, but everyone is speaking English in the chats, and the questions are already in English. I'm not even translating them, so
Okay.
from Spanish to English, they're just in English.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the question is how to learn the standard library. The standard library is too big to learn cover to cover. I think you need to, decide what problem you're trying to solve, and then see if there are things in the standard that are appropriate for that. I think everyone needs to know, algorithms. Everyone needs to understand what data structures are available, and then everyone needs to know you should only use vector. Like, you're working in C++, if you don't know how, memory cache performance is going to impact your program, you shouldn't be working. You shouldn't be working in C++ if you don't understand that.
Yeah.
And vector is really the answer for almost all of those things. So yeah, like algorithms, vector, cppreference.com is essential.
Yeah.
I hit that all the time. Godbolt, uh, godbolt.org,
Yeah.
compiler explorer.
We have a list of resources, and we list some of some of those that you mentioned, and
Yeah.
because there's a question about book recommendations. So I think we got we got a repository in GitHub with the list of the most common recommended ones, like Scott Meyer's books
Yeah.
and those kind of things.
Those are a little older. Like Scott dropped
Yeah,
out
yeah,
a few.
he dropped out from C++, and but I
Yeah.
think you can still learn from the
Oh
modern C++.
yeah, for
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, so we had a question about it, but uh, there's another one. What do you think about competitive programming?
I think as a mechanism to gain practice, it's great. I think there is nothing as important as practice and training and drill. Like, C++ programming is a skill like anything else. Musicians play scales and they practice. Athletes, do drills and they practice. And programmers should be practicing, and programming competitions are great for that. You should also realize the difference between practice and a game. And you should realize the difference between a programming contest and a job, because those are very different styles.
Yeah, I've seen some people that wants to write the kind of code that they write in competition. Uh, I
Yeah.
just
So,
hate it when I see that, but yeah,
yeah.
it
Yeah.
happens.
Like, uh, one of the things I talk about all the time is like context matters, and how long is this code going to last is a really important question. And if you're writing something that's going to last for 10 minutes or an hour or a day in a programming contest, that is a very different thing than writing code that needs to last for 5 years at a place like Google. And, use the right tool for the task. That's all. But yeah, programming contests are a very valuable thing.
And we have another question. This is the first one we got in Spanish of all of them.
Okay.
And why does C++ does not implement a garbage collector?
Because of performance.
Yeah, it, it was an easy one yeah, because of
Uh,
performance.
exactly. Like, C++ is a language that isn't going to make you pay for anything that you don't need. And C++ is going to assume that you are perfect. And a perfect programmer wouldn't need a garbage collector. They can manage their memory themselves.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I
it all,
think there's also one thing I've seen mentioned in C++, like if there's something implemented, it's because there's that it that is like the most efficient way, or that's the best way it's implemented. Like if you try to implement it, it's very likely that yours is gonna be worse than the C++ implementation. So you should use the, for example, if I wanted to just because I wanted to implement my own vector, uh, maybe if I'm someone with a really clear objective and I really know where I am doing, maybe I could implement in some special cases a better
Mhm.
vector. But in most cases, my version will just be worse. So just use the standard library
Yeah,
version. What do you think
yeah.
about it?
I think that's usually true. Both parts of that. Like, if you know that you have a particularly well-defined, subtle use case, it is not rare that you can design a thing that hits just exactly that, slightly better. Uh, that said, a lot of times doesn't matter, and something like vector, string, those will be fine. Um, so it depends. A lot of the facilities in the standard library are, you know, at least very performant when they start. Uh, Sometimes they fall apart over time, but like, don't ever use std regex. Like, that is very, very slow. But
Yeah, and a related one. Do you think the algorithms of competitive programming style interviews are going anywhere or still giving a good return on investment in terms of good hires? Like, do you think like
I
those kind
don't.
of questions?
I really don't. I wish that we did more interviewing in terms of, like, I don't need to see anyone implement a linked list. I don't want you to implement a linked list. I don't want you to ever use a linked list. Like, linked lists have not been a good idea for performance for 20 years. Um, so, like, kind of no. I think it would be so much better if we did interviews based on, like, code review. Like, here's a snippet of okay but not great code. Like, point out what works, what doesn't. Like, tell me how to improve it. And importantly, tell me how to improve it without being rude. Like, I think using that as an opportunity to also, like, judge both your technical depth, but also your ability to be polite and professional.
I
And,
think
like,
people just underestimate communication. Like
mm-hmm.
they think, yeah, I'm just gonna communicate and I just will do it. But actually, it's really hard. The communication
Nope,
part is really
it
important and
is.
really hard.
It is both of those things. It's very important and very hard. But, like, we all want, like, to produce a good product, like, to have good technical outcomes. And you know what's a really good way to not have good technical outcomes? To piss off the person you're working with, right? Like, as soon as they're stressed out and they're, like, angry, like, they're not going to make good decisions, right? And, like, we need everyone to be calm, and you can only be, like, calm and using your best brain if no one's, like, being a jerk. And so it's like, if you want good technical outcomes, you have to understand that you're working with humans and you need to be nice. Yeah.
So we have uh, some questions related to the process of thinking about new functionality for C++ and how what are the steps to implement that to get that into the standard C++. Like how does it happen and how do you
Yeah.
how do you decide to
Uh,
build it?
right. So if you go to isocpp.org, which I had a link to there, there's a whole section on standardization. And one of the steps that they suggest, there's a mailing list that has interested people and some committee members. You can post ideas of, like, hey, what about a thing like this? And usually people will be able to explain if that's a good idea or not. And if it seems like maybe a good idea, there's often people that hang out on that mailing list that can help you write up a sort of formal proposal for like, hey, how would I actually get this adopted? These days, you can also, if you get on Twitter, you start, communicating with people on Twitter that are active in the C++ committee. Usually someone will be able to like help you out a little bit. Proposals don't have to be super long. If it's a small, easy feature, adding const expert to something that there's no technical reason that it's not done yet, those can be like 1 page, half a page. It's not a big deal. If you're adding like a whole new data structure, it's probably more like 5 or 10 pages. But you write it up, you figure out how to write it in sort of formal specification. And then it's a matter of, attending some committee meetings, talking through all of the design, talking through how you name things, all of that. There's a lot of steps. It is not a quick, easy thing, but it can be done. And it does make it better for all of the 5 million C++ programmers in the world.
And we got some other related questions, and they're asking about what do you think about the relation with C++ and new niche industries, and there's one about specifically about machine learning, and about new fields in which C++ could play an important role.
Yeah, I think that's a natural pairing. Like machine learning is so computationally intensive, and even when you have like accelerators and things, you're gonna be talking to the hardware at a very low level, and C++ is really good at that. So I think that is a relationship that is pretty common. I don't think it's an accident that TensorFlow and things like that are primarily written in C++, and then we give you a nice interface and something that's more pleasant to work in, like Python. But all of the heavy lifting is down in C++.
So there's another one about if you, how convenient is to start with C++20 if most of the industry do their coding based on C++11? Like, will you if yeah, but
I would probably not start on 20 just yet. Like, I don't think any of the major compilers have a really high quality implementation of all of the features in 20. And so it's going to be kind of messy and confusing for a little bit still. I think I would still I'd probably give it another year, which is sad. Like, I think to some extent the pandemic slowed a lot of things down. Like, I know that people on my team would have been working more on the standard library for C++20, but COVID happened and everyone's been a little distracted, a little harder to get work done, a little bit pulled off onto other things.
and I think finally this one is a question I get sometimes from some of my friends because I'm always telling them like all the good things about C++, and yeah, it's a kind of a fair question. Like, uh, what are the? Can you tell me 3 bad things about C++? Like, I'm always talking good about C++, so they ask me, oh, okay, tell me some bad things about C++.
So I worry a lot about how things work over time and how we get to fix our mistakes. And what I focused on when I was on committee most was when there's a problem, like, what are we going to do about it? Like, can we make breaking changes? And I was never able to get the committee to like commit one way or another. And by and large, I think, yeah, we're just never going to actually have the willingness to break old code in order to fix things and make things better in the future. And so I think by far the number one like problem with C++, which is also a benefit in C++, is that old stuff still works. But that also means old bugs will never be fixed. There's stuff in std function that I just don't like at all. I think the design is broken or bad, and we just can't fix it. I think there's places where there's just silly little things like scoped lock and lock guard are basically the same type, but one's variadic and one's not. And we can't fix that because of compatibility with pre-compiled code from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think by far the number one problem is like backwards compatibility. A secondary sort of problem is it's very old and it's very backwards compatible. And this means a lot of stuff is, this is the best that we could do given where we were at the time. And if you come at it fresh without understanding the whole story of how we got here, sometimes it doesn't make any sense. It's very confusing. So like the defaults are kind of screwy sometimes. So it is a very challenging language. It requires you to do a lot of thinking and a lot of reading and a lot of asking questions. But in the end, like if you can master all of that, it is still very much worth it.
And I think this is a very good one. Like, what do you think? Do you think C++ needs a package manager? I think that's one of yeah.
Yes, I do. I don't think it can be done, but I think it needs it. Yes.
Yeah.
I think the best that we have right now is probably VC package or maybe Conan. If you have not used either of those, I would highly recommend that you go try that out.
What do you think about Basil?
I don't think I know that one.
I think it's the public version of Blaze.
Oh, that's not really a package manager. That's a build system.
That's a build system. Okay.
Yeah. I think I have some thoughts on build systems. Basil is philosophically a much better answer than most of the builds like CMake or things like that. Like caching works. It's reproducible. It's fast. I can't express how much CMake is philosophically the wrong answer. But everyone uses it, so that's what we're going to do, I guess. But like as far as package management goes, yeah, go try VC package, maybe go try Conan. But in practice, we're never going to really win that fight because everyone does all sorts of weird, gross, only sort of legal nonsense in C++ because it gives you all the flexibility in the world. And the thing about package management is you're going to have some standards and some like restraint, and that's hard to do. So it will be very hard to get a really, really successful package management system in C++ without making a whole lot of things not valid anymore. That'll be a tough sell.
Okay. So we have talked a little bit about programming over time and like software engineering, and I know your book is about it. So can you tell us a little bit about your book so maybe we can and we can talk about it and maybe share it?
Sure. So I spent a couple of years leading this effort to write this book, the Software Engineering at Google book, the Flamingo book. And it's written by many authors from all over Google. And what we tried to do was sort of not say, this is the way to do things, but this is the way that Google does things, and to try to explain why. We've learned some things. it's a very big company. It's an old code base. It's a lot of people and a lot of code, but we've been pretty successful. And so trying to capture all of those lessons and share that with everyone so that hopefully if your companies get to be big and get to be Google sized one day, you don't have to make all of the same mistakes we did. Um, uh, we tried to focus every chapter on three major themes. We tried to look at how does this work over time, because software engineering is not the same as programming. It's not just how do I write this program, but how do I keep this program working for 5 years or 10 years. And it's also scale. It's a matter of like, how do you communicate with 10, 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000 other engineers that are working on the same code? And then how do you balance all of these like trade-offs? Like, what are you giving up in order to adopt a thing? And so we tried to feed all of those themes through all of the chapters. It's become available electronically. So I think that we're working on distributing the PDF to anyone that is attending this meetup.
Yeah, let me mention that in Spanish so everyone understand. Estamos hablando sobre el libro del cual es autor nuestro invitado Titus Winters. Es un libro sobre ingeniería de software en Google y habla sobre las lecciones aprendidas de ingeniería de software. Eh, no solamente sobre programación, sino qué pasa cuando no solamente tienes que programar, sino tomas en cuenta el tiempo y tomas en cuenta que tiene que el- los programas que haces tienen que crecer con el tiempo y con cómo le comunicas todo esto a muchos ingenieros. Entonces, si les interesa de cómo se hace la ingeniería en Google, nos va a compartir el libro en PDF y lo podemos, ah, lo van a poder bajar gratuitamente eh, con permiso del autor. Entonces, si están viendo este stream o si están en la comunidad, pueden obtener el libro de manera legal y si les interesa cómo hacen ingeniería en Google, que yo creo que a muchos de los que están aquí, sí, eh, pueden obtener este libro de manera gratuita. Lo vamos a poner en la página y lo podemos distribuir. Ya, gracias. So,
Yep.
any other thing? I think we're close to 9 p.m. here and like 11 or something in New York.
It's almost 11.
I think
Yep.
we should start to wrap
Yep.
this up. Uh,
Yep.
I
Well,
think
thank you so much for having me.
yeah. Thank you for coming to the uh, first meetup. And yeah, let me mention it in Spanish. Muchas gracias por a nuestro invitado Titus Winters por venir. Él ofreció voluntariamente eh, cuando vio que estábamos iniciando la comunidad de C++ México en el chat de Google. Él ofreció dar una plática, entonces fue muy amable de su parte venir a platicar con nosotros y ahora tenemos la experiencia de que todo es remoto y más o menos facilitó algunas cosas. Una de las pocas cosas buenas que trajo esta pandemia. So I was mentioning about how pandemic made some things easier and how how you uh, uh,
Yep.
you were willing to come to a talk. And when I
Yep.
posted the about our community in the Google chat, yeah,
Yep. Yep. The pandemic has been good for
but
this. Not a
for a
lot
few
of
things,
things.
yeah. But
But
I think at least it has a few good things, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just, I think, a final part of the present. I'm just gonna mention again the contact that where people can find us, and I
Yep.
think that's gonna be it for tonight. And thank you very much again
Yeah.
for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Uh, yeah, just gonna mention You can find us. Nos pueden encontrar en la página, nuestra página web, en Twitter, eh, por Twitch, por YouTube transmitimos. El grupo de Telegram, donde no solamente hablamos de C++, sino de programación en general y lenguajes relacionados. Temas que pudieran ser de interés para este tipo de programadores de C++. Y tenemos un servidor de Discord. En Twitter, yo fui el anfitrión, Big Fred, y Titus Winters. Lo pueden encontrar en Twitter como todo junto, Titus Winters. Is there any other channel you would like to
No,
tell us about it?
no,
Just
no.
for
Twitter's
Twitter
my
is,
big public. Yeah.
yeah, mine too. And además, les recuerdo, tengo un stream donde hago sobre algoritmos los domingos. Y pues sería todo. Gracias a todos los presentes que estuvieron por aquí compartiendo esto. Esto se va a quedar grabado, pero solamente en YouTube. Y todas las partes donde hablamos en inglés las voy a subtitular. I'm gonna subtitle all the parts where we spoke only English. So,
Yep.
and it's gonna be available on YouTube afterward.
Okay.
So, again, thank you, and I
Yeah.
hope we can meet again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep. Buenas noches.
Bye.
Bye.
Y pues ya aquí se termina el stream, amigos. Gracias y hasta la próxima.